In this video, we'll be talking about the basics of practicing finger patterns on the violin. A finger pattern is essentially any combination of putting our four fingers that we use on any of the four strings. Depending on the key that you're in, you'll use a different combination of whole steps, that is to say wider spacing, versus half steps, the smaller spacing. So again, depending on what key you're in, and on different strings, you'll use a different combination of those types of spacings. The two most common finger patterns would be a major finger pattern, where we have a half step between our second and third fingers, and then the minor finger pattern, where we have a half step between our first and second fingers. It's important to recognize where the half step is and how that changes the balance of our whole entire arm and hand. For instance, if the half step is between 1 and 2, such as with the minor finger pattern, that leans the hand more towards our lower two fingers, our first and second fingers, leaving our third and fourth fingers having to reach quite far in comparison, versus a more relaxed major tetrachord, where we have the half step between our second and third fingers. In this finger pattern, it's much easier to reach our fourth finger than it is when we have a low second finger. In that case, the entire hand is shifted slightly more towards the first and second fingers. So when practicing finger patterns, it's important to be conscious and aware of where our hand is angled towards, and that can include wrist angle, that can include how far forward or backwards the elbow is, that can also include knuckle height, whether we need to come higher or lower from the fingerboard. And the goal is always achieving a comfortable, well-balanced hand, as well as very accurate intonation, and being very conscientious of the intonation that we want. So when we're practicing finger patterns, ideally we would do it daily, because when we take, for example, those two most common ones, the major and minor finger patterns, those are patterns that we'll find in almost every aspect of standard repertoire. So if you practice these major and minor finger patterns along with a few others that are also very common, then you'll essentially have prepared yourself to tackle most repertoire for the violin, and make your life a whole lot easier, having practiced it before even getting to the piece itself. It's also important to practice these finger patterns in different combinations, so not just straight up and down. If we practice it in broken thirds, this also prepares us for other iterations of this finger pattern, along with going backwards, or we can also focus on balancing towards a certain finger if we have a finger that is more consistently problematic, which in most cases would probably be our pinky or our fourth finger. So it's important to practice tetrachords that perhaps disadvantage the pinky finger, so that we strengthen the muscles and the parts of the arm that enable our pinky finger to still be placed accurately and with a good amount of strength. Strangely enough, our fingers do not have any muscles. So the awareness of the entire hand and arm, even up to the shoulder, is imperative for successfully practicing finger patterns, because if we just think from our base knuckle to the tip of our finger, we won't be having that same awareness of our muscles that are actually making the motion happen, which is where we could potentially get into the tension issues if we're not being conscientious of, say, an overstretched fourth finger, where we're at risk of pulling potentially muscles, potentially ligaments and tendons, so on and so forth. So it's always important to ask those questions. How high do our knuckles have to be, or how low? How far backwards our elbow should be? For the G string, our elbow should be farther forward to reach comfortably, whereas for the E string, our elbow should be farther backwards to reach more comfortably. And finally, our wrist angle should also be considered. For instance, if we're If the half steps are in the lower fingers, then our wrist might want to come in slightly in order to enable the pinky finger to reach more successfully. Whereas if our wrist is too far out, then our pinky is severely disadvantaged by that. So finger patterns are really one of the most important learning concepts in order to bring awareness to all of the muscles that enable our fingers to even get to the string in the first place and get there successfully, comfortably, and in tune.